When this was first brought up, how do you kind of do holidays without religion? It struck me as a very odd question, because certainly as far as Christianity, holidays have been celebrated primarily without Christianity because they're far older than Christianity. Every civilization I've ever heard of has a winter festival, a harvest festival, and a spring festival. Those get wrapped up in the trappings of the day and come to be associated with religion, but that's not at all essential to what the thing is. So to kind of show that, I'm going to run through some examples of holiday practices from other traditions where it's definitely not a Christian festival, and show how much they have in common. And that starting part on Christmas will actually come back and look at the other extreme. It used to be a religious thing to refuse to participate in holidays, and a trace of that still exists in, for example, certain sects like Jehovah's Witnesses won't participate in celebration. Let's wrap it up, say a little about our personal experiences. Yeah? All right, so start with the big one, right? The winter solstice. Because it's easily observed without serious equipment to be the shortest day of the year, at least in the northern hemisphere, you can find evidence of it being recognized and even some sort of social acknowledgement of it as early as 10,000 BC, so it's clearly not a Christian thing. And in fact, if you look at the Roman version of the winter solstice thing, they had a month of Saturnalia, during which fell Juvenalia and festival honoring Mithras. And how you spell that is a really excellent question, because it depends on where you look. And you can see things that we associate with Christmas all over it. Goodwill toward men. During Saturnalia, the slaves were temporarily freed and led into the house to join the feast. Juvenalia, as you might guess from the name, has a lot to do with honoring children. And Mithras is particularly interesting because the day of the festival was December 25th, and he was actually a Persian god of light. So the same thing is celebrated in Iran as well. But you go to other traditions, there's a Scandinavian Yule log. They would light it up and feast as long as it was still burning, and there was a story of how every spark off of it was a new calf was going to be born to their herd. And the Festival of Lights, clearly related to our use of lights. And if you look at the use of evergreens, that's just all over the place. But that's not surprising when early cultures are concerned about getting through the winter, how they're going to honor and celebrate plant life that doesn't go dormant over the winter. So that's everywhere. So, put very well by somebody called Russell Fleming. So what can we derive from this merging of pagan and Christian? People through the ages with many beliefs shared common bonds in their celebrations, fellowship, rituals, good cheer, giving of gifts. These traditions never go out of favor, whatever the time, whatever the place. You can or choose not to wrap it up in religious terminology, but that ultimately doesn't really change very much. So, my claim would be celebrations, festivals of some sort are a pretty fundamental social feature, and the older they are and the more widespread they are, often they have something to do with very primitive concerns, the harvest, acknowledging the winter, acknowledging the return of plant life in the spring. They share certain core aspects. They don't really have much to do with religion, but they can take on peripheral features related to whatever the current cultural religious environment is. So to go all the way in the other direction, in early certainly colonial, but even post United States founding time, it would have been the other way around. You would have been less likely to celebrate holidays if you were religious, indicating it really doesn't have a lot to do with religion. The Pilgrims were strict Puritans, called it Fool's Tide. And if they found that on December 25th you were feasting or you didn't go to work, they'd fine you 5 shillings, which was a big deal in 17, whatever. And their reasoning had to do with it still had pagan traces in it and just a general distaste for indulgence. That went on past the institution of the US Constitution, and in fact the Senate assembled on Christmas Day 1797 because it was a normal day. It wasn't a federal holiday until 1870, and this is the big one, right? So to ask how you can celebrate a holiday without religion, they sort of fall in and out of phase, but basically they don't have a lot to do with each other. So these are more examples just of the other sort of common denominator ones that are pretty much universal. There's always a harvest festival. It always involves feasting. There's always a spring festival. It always has something to do with light, and this is the case in the Incan one, the pyramid, remember? Pyramid of Kukulkan. If you get it right on the equinox, its shadow comes directly in front of one of its faces, and it's intended to look like a snake. It's the return of the sun serpent. But where we get the name Easter is a Germanic pronunciation. Good one. Ostara, which morphed into a Saxon Oestra. And that's how we get our wonky, what is the date of Easter? It's because of these guys. The first full moon following the vernal equinox, which isn't quite the modern way of doing it, but shows you where we got the weird system we do use. And the historical evidence for it being an actual legend people told each other is not that great, but it's often cited that there was a legend where Oestra found a bird wounded on the ground late in winter. To save it, turned it into a hare, but not completely. It kept laying eggs, and the hare would honor her for saving him by decorating his eggs and leaving them as gifts. Spring festivals always have a rebirth and honoring the return of the light to them. And in fact, to revisit Mithras, or however it's said, not only was that Persian god of light, who the Romans also honored because the Romans just liked taking everybody else's gods and saying, yeah, sure, that's good. Not only was he born on the winter solstice, which apparently they thought was December 25th, but was resurrected in the spring and honored again in a spring festival. Sound familiar? It's all the same stuff. It always has been long before Christianity. Every civilization anybody's ever heard of has a harvest festival, a spring festival, and a winter solstice festival. Some version or another. And they all share things in common just because of what they are. It ultimately doesn't have much to do with religion. Personally, now you have to talk.
Okay, so growing up for both of us, we both lived in households that were not religious, but we lived in households where holidays were celebrated and a big deal, but it was about things like, getting together with family, and, we were gift givers, and we did that. When we were raising our son when he was very young, Easter had always actually been his favorite holiday because we concentrated on the Easter egg hunt. That was a big deal in our family, and I spent a lot of time prepping an Easter egg hunt where it was, based on
Key to his age.
Yeah, like there would be an egg with a clue in it that he had to put together, and then that went to another one that had a new clue, and it was tied to the age that he was at the time, and You know,
It
when he was
started with,
learning math, there was,
little pictures in there.
yeah,
And ended up the last year he was interested in doing it were coordinates.
yeah, so we had a map and he would map out coordinates and find out where the next egg was and so on. And so it got more and more complicated to match what he was doing at the time. And we had one that was used the genetic code to identify letters that all came together to state where the, so we put a lot of emphasis in that sort of activity, and we still celebrated Easter. We still certainly dyed eggs and did all that sort of stuff. There just wasn't a religious component. We've always been very big fans of Halloween. Both of us have birthdays in that month, and so we grew up with kind of an emphasis, independently obviously, but we grew up with emphasis on that month as being special and doing Halloween celebrations and stuff. And the one thing I was going to mention in some of the stuff that he talked about as we're progressing through this is, it was in one of the slides, but there really is a need, a very clear sociological, psychological, human need for holidays. There has to be something to look forward to. And one of the things that has made that very clear to me is what happened during the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, people weren't able to get together with family and weren't able to celebrate things and have parties and stuff. And I think that's a big part of why we struggled with that process, because there wasn't anything coming next. There wasn't anything to pace yourself towards. And that is very troubling to a human being, to not have that. It makes every day seem like every other day. And that is difficult on us. And so it's very clear to me how important it is to have those milestones that you get to, whether it is Christmas or Easter or, you know, the 4th of July or whatever. There's a next thing always. And that is completely independent of any religious influence. If you were somebody who was completely without religion, you would still be celebrating something. There would be an opportunity where you would bring your family together and sit down and eat together and share things, and you know, there would still be gift giving. That all needs to be part of us as a human experience. So,
and I mean, depending on what you mean by religion, if you just mean a belief in the supernatural, well then that's probably one of the oldest human things. But if you mean religion as in they had a special building to pray in, then holidays are older than religion.
oh yes, yeah. And then also on this slide is a book that I purchased back when my son was very, very young, and it was a really
Before
good
even
thing.
showed up, right?
I think so. It was a really good thing to have. So it's called Parenting Beyond Belief. And it's about a lot of this sort of stuff, not just, you know, to do with religion and holidays, but certainly things about places where you can engage your child in learning about moral behavior and so on that is not religious based. Things like, you know, I remember it talked about Boy Scouts and things like that, where you're still setting up a teaching situation with how to behave properly and so on, and sources of that beyond religious. And so that's still out there, it's still published, and it was a great book.
New edition recently, actually.
Okay. Any questions?
I guess for me, something I am curious about is just through this process of kind of looking on to say that I didn't really celebrate holidays with religion. What would you say was kind of a culture shock for y'all, especially going into Mississippi or kind of even interacting with other people back in California?
To do specifically with holiday celebration.
Right.
A little minor one when we didn't really know what Ash Wednesday was.
Oh yeah, that took us a while to figure that one out, actually. Yes, I remember the very beginning, the seeing people with the ash and having to realize that that was not by
That's
accident.
intentional.
Yeah. So that was something. Obviously, it's been nice to, you know, we have never had to make arrangements to make sure we're at a church on any of these days. We can stay home with each other, and that's what we're trying to do here, is celebrate family and, you know, the successes of our family members and getting together and stuff. And so we've never had to work around a trip to a church or a trip to some sort of event as a result of that. I can say though, this just occurred to me, there have been some interesting things to do with Halloween. Because obviously we do Halloween big, and we've always concentrated on the creepy and scary more than the fun Halloween, so we do a lot of that kind of stuff, and have had, I'll never forget the first year that we lived in our neighborhood, the neighbor, who's a very kind gentleman across the street, came over and said, "Oh, you're putting up ghosts." And I said, "Yeah." And that was pretty much the end of the conversation, and it didn't occur to me until after the fact that he was actually concerned by that, you know, whereas it is so separate in my head from anything to do with religion that it just didn't even dawn on me that anyone would have a problem with it. I do find it sort of sad though that there are a number of homes in our neighborhood that don't hand out candy, turn the lights out and so on, and the reason for it is because they are
Reason for some of them.
for some of them, yes,
are just lazy.
yeah, right, but the reason, I know that the reason for some of them is
Religious
objection, yeah.
So,
And
I mean,
just, the idea of those having anything to do with one another is so odd to me.
the
'cause-
fact that you could ask somebody else the question, how do you deal with Halloween with religion?
Yeah,
And in fact, 150 years ago, you could have asked, how do you deal with Christmas given that you're religious? Just shows that it's an accident of history that you think of holidays as being a religious observance. They don't really have anything to do with each other.
yeah. I think also related to this is, you know, it was always very fundamental for, I know myself, and I think you were the same way growing up. I never believed in the Easter Bunny or Santa. From very young, my parents were honest with us about that, and it was always presented as, but there's this fun story
Yeah.
that we stick with. It's kind of part of the fun of Christmas time. And so that's very similar to how I feel about a lot of religious stuff. There's this, you know, this clear designation of what is real and provable and all that kind of stuff. And so we did the same thing with our son, and never ever suggested there really was a person up
Right.
north. I mean, it was just always, this is part of the fun, silly stories
Well,
of Christmas time.
I mean, I don't want to diminish it by saying it's not an attempt to characterize objective reality. I mean, anytime somebody's telling a story, they're trying to get some meaning, some point across.
Yeah.
What's the message of the story about a fat guy in a red suit who gives kids presents all the time? That it's really wonderful to give things to kids.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
it's not a claim about objective reality, it's a claim about, or not even a claim, it's an attempt to communicate a message, which is true of any kind of story.
Yeah. And we definitely, you know, we had to warn him to, he had to understand
Don't tell
that
the other
other
kindergartners.
kids, might actually believe this person really exists. I mean, we put out a plate of cookies, and every single year of my son's childhood, I wrote a silly letter from Santa and left, we had what was called the Santa gift. The next morning, there'd be one gift that was for the family as a whole. Always, it was something, you know, a game system or something that we all used. And that was Santa's gift. And we continued the ruse the whole time, even though he clearly knew from the moment he was verbal that there was no such thing. But that's fun to pretend. And so I think that was how we treated all of those things. So we still definitely adhere to a lot of the traditions of holidays. We get a tree, we decorate the house, we do all that sort of stuff. Both of us grew up in households, I don't know how this happened, that we both had the same thing, but where we opened gifts Christmas Eve instead of Christmas morning.
Well, except kids got an extra one.
Yeah,
Christmas morning.
so
That
Christmas
was the
morning was
Santa.
the Santa gift and the stockings, and, you know, I mean, we would joke about, oh, well, Santa, you know, we don't have a fireplace, so Santa comes in through the side door or something like that, you know, so we did all of that stuff just because it's fun, you know. I'll never forget the time we went to the mall to take, our son to the, to see the or I guess we didn't go to see the Easter Bunny, but he was there. And Alex wandered over to see the Easter Bunny. He was very young, just barely had started walking and talking, and came back and asked me why the man inside the bunny suit was coughing. So like, it was just, you know, we were gonna just enjoy it and have fun with it, and it was completely always independent of any religious influence.
Given the influence of religion on holidays in the area that we live in, did either of you or your son ever feel isolated celebrating holidays without religion?
It was always a family matter anyway.
Yeah.
I mean,
It was always just us, and, you know, we don't have family here. So our family on both sides are out of state. So when we were doing something here locally, it was just gonna be us anyways. Like, that was just always the case. So there wasn't any separation from people. And we both have family that are not religious, so that it just never really comes up as an issue. I will say, on a totally separate topic from holidays, there is one thing that I feel like I doubt he would feel the same way, but I feel like I personally do sort of miss out on that connection to the community that comes with a weekly visit to a church. Somebody gets sick and you get the casseroles that show up, that kind of stuff. I would talk to friends who would say, well, you know, they need something, and so they would ask around at church and find someone. That connection there's no substitute for that, for somebody who is not church going. There really isn't. I remember we saw something, one of the shows, the series that we watched, where they were talking about a group. It was a secularist group. It started in Britain, England, somewhere, and they had brought it to the US a little bit, and they would meet and have weekly, everybody gets together, and every now and then there's a potluck, and you know, so to mimic that environment without there being a religious intent. And I remember thinking that would be nice to have something like that, because that is missing. And I don't have that connection. Obviously, I have to, you know, it ends up being my work friends, or it ends up being something along those lines, because you don't connect with other people. Church ends up being an easy way to make that happen.
and since it occupies such a large role, it becomes the basis for a lot of people's social interactions. Where
Right.
in a less predominantly religious environment, there might be other ways that gets expressed, which are more generally accessible.
I guess one more question that I have as well is, I guess to the audience kind of listening on later on in the video, that when it comes up, is what would you say to them that say have maybe some sort of questions or have some sort of objection to taking, I guess, Christ out of Christmas or something like that? What would you say to people who still look at doing this skeptically, despite the information presented that this holiday and
Christ wasn't in Christmas.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's not taking him out of Christmas. We put him in very recently.
Well, we
Okay.
put him in a long time ago, but the idea of struggling against emphasis on other aspects, they're older, more fundamental, and it used to be that the Christians were the ones who didn't want there to be any Christmas. So this is just an accident of history. Try and gain a little perspective. The concept that Christian thinking is being marginalized in the United States is so ridiculous as to be beneath contempt. So
Yeah. And I mean,
I don't know what to tell
ultimately,
you. There's plenty of Christ in Christmas. You want more. I'm not interested. I'm not sure what we're arguing about, because Christ has very little to do with Christmas.
and
always
really,
have.
if you if you look at how we celebrate Christmas, we do all the things that, you know, we give gifts, we sit with family, we share, we eat, we do all the things that would be Christ-like. You know, we give to charitable organizations, we do all of that stuff. So even without that religious context, all of the positives are still incorporated into that event. And so I'm not sure what putting Christ back in would give us. I'm not sure what that adds.
Do you have any advice for people who may want to celebrate Christmas from a non-religious perspective, but who aren't fortunate like you and still have family that are possibly still deeply religious?
Well, on the flip side, the religious trappings understood as sort of the dressing of the current cultural environment don't seem troubling in a family environment, so sure, they want to add to it. What do Christians do that we don't?
I don't know, I mean,
Go to mass or whatever?
Yeah,
Have
that's
that
about
be
it.
part of it.
Yeah.
If it's important to you to be with family, there's no reason not to go to mass if that strikes you as something to do.
I have sat down at many tables where grace is said, and I just quietly sit. And I'm not gonna say anything. I'm not begrudging that behavior. It's fine. It's important to those individuals. It's not important to me, but I'm going to respect it.
And in a case like that where, again, it takes on the element of a story. They're trying to say they're glad they have so many good things. Great, me too.
Yeah.
If it's understood as being a cultural expression and not a claim about the way the world is structured, I don't have any objection to religious things. If you would like to be with your family to go to mass, then do it. If you want to skip out on it and hang out with them later, do that too. But I guess part of the advantage of not being beholden to a religious tradition is if you want to respect and even participate in some observances, there's no reason not to.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily needs to be something that really changes a whole lot about your behaviors. I mean, you can have a different perspective and decide that, okay, we're gonna get together not because it's, December 25th means something in particular, but rather because I wanna see my family and I wanna be around people or, friends that I care about and exchange gifts with one another and have, good food and celebrate having made it through the year. And, so that's more of an internal perspective shift than it is any change in the activities that are happening.